Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nyema Mitchell, and I'm a director here at JFS. And I'm super excited today to be talking to Jeff Selingo, who is the author of Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions. Jeff, I'm going to pause here and allow you to introduce yourself and talk to us a little bit about your book.
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me to talk about the book. So I've been in and around higher education for more than 2 decades. I'm former editor of the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I spent 16 years in a variety of roles. I'm the author of 2 previous books, College Unbound, and There Is Life After College. And now I've kind of gone to the beginning of the process, which is talking about the admissions process with this latest book called Who Gets In and Why. I'm also a special advisor to Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State University.
Great, thank you. For our audience who's joining us today, can you tell us just a brief overview of the book, sort of what you did? Part of it's in the title with A Year Inside College Admissions, but just walk us a little bit through what it's about.
So several years ago, I reread a book called Fast Food Nation, which dove into kind of the history of fast food and took you into this ecosystem that people kind of see every day, but don't really understand, and led us inside that process. They took us inside a McDonald's, a franchise, a potato farm, a meatpacking plant, right? They took us inside the process. And I wanted to do the same thing with admissions, because in many ways, admissions is a business. It's a huge business, a $9 billion business of all the associated pieces of it, from testing to marketing. And so the goal with this book was to take readers into that process throughout the course of a year, looking at 3 buckets of characters, one being the institution. So I was embedded in 3 colleges and universities: Davidson College in North Carolina, Emory University in Atlanta, and the University of Washington in Seattle. So a big public, a big private, and a small liberal arts college. The second bucket was students. I followed a group of more than 30 high school seniors the year I was embedded in the process, who were applying to all different types of schools from all over the country. I ended up really focusing on 3 in the book, and also spent time with their families and their high school counselors. The third bucket is an important one, and those are the influencers that kind of are in the background of the college admissions process. They include the marketing agencies, the financial aid advisors to colleges that say, if we just give you $500 more, maybe you'll come, the testing agencies, the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And it's that third bucket that are heavily influential in the process that most students and counselors and others don't know the levers that they're pulling in the background. And I wanted to show readers what was happening with all 3 of these buckets of characters, that we then go through the whole book through the process of a year, starting in the beginning of the academic year to the end.
Great, thank you. And so I'd love to hear, through this in-depth year-long experience and the research that you did, what off the bat sort of surprised you the most? You got into the trenches, you talk about actually observing conversations that different application reviewers were having. What are some of the things that just you're like, wow, I wish I kind of either known that when I was applying to college, or I can't believe that this is actually part of the admissions discussions?
I think 2 things were really surprising to me. One is that the college admissions process is not about the applicant, but it's about the college, its needs, and its priorities. So every college and university has a collection of needs based on what it wants to accomplish. So they may want more students from a particular part of the country, more students who major in the humanities or STEM. Their needs might be very narrow. I talk a lot in the book about athletics and the need of coaches to field a team. So whatever those needs are, that they manifest themselves in the admissions process. So as I tell students, even if a college has a 25% acceptance rate, doesn't mean you as an individual applicant have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in. You might have a 90% chance of getting in, depending on what the college needs at a particular point, or a 0% chance if you're like all the other applicants. And most of this process is not transparent to students and parents and counselors and others who help students apply, they really don't know what the priorities of a college might be. And this is why, to most students, college admissions kind of seems unfair, particularly to more selective colleges, because I think the important thing is that while in the book I focus on more selective institutions, those meaning that those that accept fewer than 50% of students, they only really account for about 200 colleges and universities in the country when we have thousands of colleges and universities in the country. And indeed, the average acceptance rate is 65% of most colleges and universities. So I think that's important to remember, that while when we talk about college admissions, we tend to think sometimes, I think, about these selective colleges because those are the ones the media focus on. It is really easier to get into college in many cases than it was even many years ago. So that's the first thing that surprised me. The second thing was, again, at the selective schools that I followed, was how deep and wide the applicant pools are. So what's happened over the last 40 years in admissions is the concept of distance changed in the minds of many students. And so the idea of going from Boston to California may not seem as far as it did back in the the 80s, before the rise of the internet and telecommunications and discount airlines. And so what's happening now as a result is that the best students from around the world are entering the same admissions pools for these selective colleges. And so when I was sitting in these rooms and I would read an application, I'd be like, wait a second, didn't we just see this application 5 applications ago? And what you come to realize is that all of these students have done such, in some cases, like really amazing things. And there's just so many of them. And this is why in many cases, it's much more difficult to get in again to these selective colleges.
Yes, I think there was a point I remember you made early on in the book, is that you would think that there were like not enough seats in college for everyone who essentially wanted, that it's a scarce actual resource. And if we could, eliminate the cost associated with it, and even distance in some cases, that most people who wanted a seat in college could actually get into some sort of higher education institution. But there's been a sort of a shift in sort of the marketing around, that's very heavily focused on these selective institutions that you talk about in your book. And that sort of leads me to ask about the influence that Bill Royale had on how we connect, or how institutions connect with prospective students, and how he sort of took this sort of strategy for political mailers and transformed really the market for communicating with prospective students. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Bill was a really interesting character in the book, and I got to meet him. Unfortunately, he passed away right after right before the book came out. But I had a chance to spend some time with him in Richmond, and Bill was he was very influential in taking direct marketing to essentially the next level. Direct marketing is not new in college admissions. People were getting brochures in the mail back in the 70s, but what he did was really systematize the process in a way that sent mail, for example, to sophomores and juniors and not just seniors. He rushed to get these mailers in the mailbox of students, of prospective students, earlier, faster and earlier, by basically getting names of prospective students from the College Board and other places before his competitors did. He sent a lot more mail, not only in the snail mail days, but also email. And he also came up with this idea of the offer, so that students would send back reply cards and say they were interested. And all of this, of course, in the era of big data, became more important. And so that really, what he really wanted to do was gin up interest in colleges and universities. So rather than wait for applicants, they were overwhelmed with applicants, particularly of the schools that he helped put on the map. And the goal here was that as these schools stayed the same in terms of their enrollment, the goal was to grow their applicant pool, so then they would look more selective. Because if you grew the number of students applying, but you only enrolled the same number year after year, your acceptance rate would drop because you would accept fewer students and more people would be applying. Or even if you accepted the same number of students with more people applying, you looked more selective. And that was his goal. His goal was not, when you got an piece of mail when you're 18, you think, wow, this is great. X university wants me. Well, what he really was doing was, no, X university doesn't want you. They want your application to make themselves look more selective. And that's really the big change that he made in admissions.
It's so funny to hear you say that. I distinctly remember this. I was entered into college in the fall of 2000, and I remember being overwhelmed with mailers from colleges and really feeling special about it, and thinking that something about what they were able to find out about made me really attracted to that college. And so obviously this sort of strategy worked. Can you talk a little bit about sort of then the role that the rankings with U.S. News and World Report play in this whole sort of strategy of recruiting students?
Yeah, and again, what happened was colleges wanted to look more selective, in part because at the time, and they don't do it anymore, U.S. News was looking at selectivity as one of their measures. And when you look at all the measures that U.S. News measures for its rankings, this was one of the easiest things to manipulate. Because as I said, if you just got more applications and accepted the same number, you were going to look more selective. And so that's what colleges and universities did to try to game the rankings and move up in them. I talk a lot in the book about Northeastern University, which under a previous president in the late 1990s really looked at the U.S. News and World Report rankings as an important metric. They were at the time were 148 or something like that, and they wanted to move into the top 100. That was a goal that Northeastern had. And so he had his folks reverse engineer the rankings and said, how can we move into the top 100? And so they did all of these things, some cases maybe in the best interest of students, but others not necessarily, in order to move up those rankings.
So in kind of talking about rankings and particularly bringing the example of Northeastern, can you talk to everyone about what you describe as buyers and sellers in the context of institutions and what that means for their admissions process?
Yeah, so buyers and sellers is an important lens that I wanted to put on the admissions process, because I think often we talk about admissions in terms of fit. And we often say, we want to have a good academic fit, a good social fit in terms of colleges, but we don't often talk about the financial fit, right? We're told by colleges, we're a good value, we give out financial aid, right? All these things, right? So students, I think, are led too often to believe, figure out where you fit academically and socially, apply, get in, and then you can figure out how to pay for it. Unfortunately, what I saw too often in the process is that many students looked at it in that way and then got in to the schools that they wanted to get into and then couldn't afford it. So I wanted to put a lens on this idea of buyers and sellers. Buyers are the large amount of schools that discount their tuition, in some cases by a lot, in order to attract students. Doesn't mean their education is subpar, but it means that they may just not have the name brand in order to attract a lot of applicants. And so as a result, they have to offer these discounts or coupons to get students in the door. Again, the vast majority of colleges are buyers. There's a small selection of sellers, mostly the highly selective schools in particular, that are sellers. They are overwhelmed with applicants for a small number of spots. And so they don't have to, they have something to sell in terms of their degree, the value in the marketplace, and they don't have to discount their tuition like the buyers do. And again, I think that if students kind of understand the distinctions in this marketplace between these two types of institutions, some that give out a lot of financial aid, others that give out less or really focused on need-based financial aid, then I think that as they're thinking about admissions, they could start to put that financial lens on the fit piece of this. Because again, I think when students are looking at colleges and universities, it should be about the academic fit, the social fit, but also the financial fit.
Yeah, that reminds me of sort of Grace, one of the students that you follow in your book, and her story about, not actually having the financial conversation with her parents until almost it was too late, right? Like that ended up having to, kind of make some of the decision for her. And I mentioned to you earlier, when I talked to a lot of my friends about this book, I was like, how soon did the money conversation come up? because with my mother, it came up very early. She's like, I cannot afford to pay for you to go to college. You're going to have to figure it out. But I can imagine for a lot of middle class and upper middle class students, they can, have assumptions about sort of what they think their parents' finances are. But having that conversation much sooner than students often do can impact where they apply.
Yeah, and it's critical. I mean, obviously, the biggest issue we have in this country is getting first generation and low income students into college and paying for college. But we're also increasingly having a middle class gap among a lot of colleges, as many college officials call it, the donut hole. Right? You have students at the upper echelons of the income scale. They get to go to college, obviously, because they can afford to pay the full price. You have lower income students at some colleges that get all the aid that they need in order to afford it. Again, that's still at a very small portion of colleges, and it's the biggest problem we face. But increasingly, the second biggest problem we face as a country is getting the middle class students who are often kind of in the middle. They make some money, or they make enough money to get over the lowest levels of financial aid, but then they don't make even close to enough money to afford to pay the full sticker price like wealthier students do. And it's a real concern among a lot of the admissions officers that I spend time with, right? These are the kids of firefighters and police and teachers and things like that, right? Where you might even have a dual income household, but just not making enough to really qualify for financial aid on one hand, but definitely not enough to pay for college on the other hand. Again, not the biggest problem we face now, but one of the larger problems I think we're going to face over the next 10 years.
So one of the things that's coming up, that has come up, and it's actually in the preface part of your book, is about how COVID drove some changes to the admissions process that really kind of came up right around the time that your book was about to be published. And there are some pretty significant changes that happened, such as the no longer using the SAT or standardized tests as a requirement for admissions. Do you think that there are any sort of COVID-driven changes like that might be here to stay, that particularly could play to the benefit particularly for Black and Brown and low-income students who, oftentimes have been sort of, not making it across the threshold for some of the more selective institutions?
Yeah, and I think there are two changes in particular that I think will stick that can help students that have been underrepresented, particularly at these more selective colleges that I followed. Number one is test optional. So we know that testing has largely a proxy for family income. Students who come from wealthier families do better on the tests, just well researched over the years. But we also know the test really is a proxy for first year grades, is a representative of first year grades in college. It's not about college success at all. And so many colleges went test optional during the pandemic. I don't think a lot of them are going to go back. I think some of them will, probably the Ivy League, probably the very selective, probably a lot of big state universities will do under political pressure. But for the most part, I think that 600 colleges went test optional during the pandemic. We may have hundreds of them not go back as a result. And I think this will help underrepresented students because the tests are biased in terms of particularly of family income. The second thing that I think is going to happen is the recruitment process is going to shift a little bit. So one of the things that colleges, universities did a lot of during the pandemic was what we're doing here, virtual events, where they, instead of going to high schools or going to college fairs, or more so expecting students to spend money to come to them, get on a plane, get in a car to go visit the campus, they've zoomed into students' homes. And I think that's going to continue. And that, I think, would really help students who do not have access to a high-performing high school. And as a result, as I talk in the book about Chris, who went to a rural school in Pennsylvania, he was more likely to have a military recruiter than a college recruiter at his school because, first of all, many students at his school didn't go to college, and there were about 100 kids in his graduating class, so it just wasn't worth it for colleges to go to his school. And he barely could afford to go to visit many campuses, especially outside of a day's drive from where he lived in Pennsylvania. And so because of now remote events, more colleges and universities can reach students like him, and he could develop relationships with students with colleges like that without going to visit those colleges or without a representative coming to visit high school. So I think those are going to be the two big changes coming out of COVID that I think have a real potential to impact the college going rate of students of color, of low income students, of first generation students.
That also raises a point that you talk about, particularly in Chris's case, of the role of guidance counselors in high schools. And this sort of virtual environment could sort of overcome that, for instance, for students who are coming from high schools that don't have recruiters coming to their, or admissions officers coming to their particular high school, or having access to being able to get there. That it's kind of the same way that the internet opened up the options for people to think beyond just between a particular radius that they would have access to for college, but also sort of being able to provide some additional guidance that you may not be able to get from your guidance counselor, depending on like basically the zip code of your high school.
Incredibly important. So I met Chris through the National College Advising Corps, which is a great program that places recent college graduates for 2 years in schools that have low percentage of students going to college. So they are rural schools, they're urban schools, they're schools that serve large proportions of students on free and reduced lunch, and they don't have a history of college going. And it's largely because of what I mentioned, right? Students can't get to college campuses. There's not a culture of thinking about college early enough in the school so that they take the right courses that get them to college. And rarely will colleges go visit these high schools because they're just not going to get enough students out of them. And the counselors are overwhelmed usually with social and emotional issues as well. And so they don't really focus on colleges and universities. And this is what the College Advising Corps really does. Great program. And I really wish that it could be scaled to more colleges and universities, because these are students who are near peers. And so the students listen to them because they're out of high school just a few years themselves. And they really focus on trying to increase the college going rate. They're not necessarily there to push students into, highly selective colleges. They're there to figure out where are the students going to be a good fit and help the colleges meet the students where they are.
Great. So how would you say that parents, teachers, and counselors, as they're sort of supporting their students, they can help them make better decisions about where to apply and what's actually important for their success? I know towards the end of the book, you sort of walk through like some general advice, but if you had to pick the sort of like top 1 to 2 things that they should really focus on to help their students make a better decision, what would you say they should do?
Well, I think first of all, they should focus on building a balanced list. What is reasonable for that academic, social, and financial fit that I talked about earlier? Too often, I think students just they're poorly matched with their list, and they either don't get in, they can't afford it, or it's just a poor match academically or socially. So I think that's important. Second is, what is important to you? What do you want to get out of college? Again, I think we focus too often on the brand names in higher education. And we think that because they have a brand name or they're highly ranked, they must be of high quality. But when I talk to alumni about their college experience, one of the things they talk often about are the people they met, the mentors that they had that really led them to where they are in life today. And that's really what you're trying to get to. You're really trying to get to the people. And there's so often many questions that you can ask in the college search process to make sure, are you going to have faculty members who care about you and care about you as a person? Are you going to be able to meet with them after class and office hours? Are you going to have coaches or other mentors or other advisors in clubs and activities that you might be part of who are, again, going to care for you and think about where you want to go in your life, both academically, career-wise, socially? And that's really what you're looking for. To me, that's the ultimate value of the college degree, not whether it's, whether the institution is ranked number 5 or number 10, because at the end of the day, when you're talking about the top 50 universities or top 100 universities, there's very little difference between them. We like to think there are differences, but there really are not at the end of the day between some of these institutions that are highly ranked.
So for my last question, if you could wave a magic wand, or if you were Jeff Bezos for the day, what would you do to make the admissions process more equitable?
Well, first of all, I would stop asking for all the things that colleges and universities ask for in their application: 10 activities, a couple of essays, a couple of recommendations, right? It really discourages, I think, students who don't have access to people to help them with their essays, or how to work during high school, and so thus can't participate in multiple activities. all these things don't matter as much as colleges think they do to the ultimate success of students. And so I wish they would pare back the application as well. For a second, going back to what we talked about earlier, really trying to figure out how to connect with students in under-resourced high schools that don't have the resources to come to visit them on campus. You're not going to go visit them in their high school. How can we get them more engaged in the college process earlier on? To me, Laura Powell Jobs just gave this great commencement address at Penn, and in it she talks about why she became so interested in college access by going to a high school years ago and realizing there was so much talent in this high school class, but because they didn't take the right courses in 8th grade, they didn't take the SAT, for example, at that point, they couldn't get into some colleges as a result. And I think that, to me, admissions is really around information. And the more information that you have, the better off you're going to be in the process, and getting information in the right hands to help students who are underrepresented in higher education and might be on under-resourced high schools. Getting that information in their hands at the right time is critically important in getting them to college, because as Laura Powell Jobs observed, this talent is equally distributed. It's just that the opportunity to get into these colleges is just so much more difficult when you don't have access to those courses, those activities, those test prep, essay prep, things like that.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And again, thank you for joining us today. This was great. I highly encourage everyone to take the time to read this book, not just because you may have a student who's preparing to go to college next year or 10 years from now, like I will, but it's really sort of just informative about something that's really important to a lot of people across this country and about their access to higher education. So thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate your time.
It was great to be with you. Thank you very much.